Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson, and I'm here with B'nai Lappi back again for this week's episode of the Oral Talmud. Hi, B'nai.
Hey Dan, how are ya?
I'm good. Interesting times that we're living in,
Yeah.
and often relevant to the Talmud. Actually, on another show that I do right before this one, called Stone News, we were looking at a section of Talmud from Tractate Pesachim, page 49b. It's all these like kind of unfortunate, it's not quite the right, but statements that are made basically about Amei Haaretz, the simple folk, and all kinds of ways that the rabbis of the Talmud kind of have a low opinion of them. And actually, it's felt very true to today. Like it felt very like a very important text to think about in terms of like what's going on in American society today and how there's this tension between those with a college degree and those without, or however we want to put it. So it's interesting how there are these resonances.
Yeah. It's funny. I love the rabbis, but I do acknowledge that they weren't feminists and they weren't populists. I don't know if populist is even the right word, but yeah, they did have a low opinion of the masses and
Mhm.
didn't really trust them. On the other hand, so I wanted to acknowledge that I love them, and so I don't know, hopefully not apologetic, maybe a little bit defensive, but they they kind of theoretically democratized Torah. They said you can actually, do this thing which puts you in conversation with God, even if you don't have the hereditary,
Hmm. Hmm.
advantage of the priest. So that's gone. It's now open to everyone, theoretically. But we're really only going to give it to this swath of the people. Not that that's so different from our own Constitution and the idea of the theory being right and the actual application and belief of where it applies being way too narrow. But they had both of those. Right, the idea that every human being could have svara,
Hmm.
could refine their moral intuition or their ethical instinct through learning, that was available to anyone, although they were going to make it really hard for a whole bunch of people like women or to do that, is a kind of belief in the person.
Hmm.
Yet
Yeah. It's that, and also I've been thinking about. So I've been reading about like the college admissions process because I have a kid applying to college now, and that's been kind of interesting too to see like well, on the one hand, there's an expansion in I think like the 50s or whenever, like that before that, colleges in America had been almost like we think of as like a boarding school, an elite boarding school today. Well, that's for the rich, and it's more about cultivating a certain kind of extension of society. It's like it's not for anybody else. It's not like what we think of it today, that college is where you go to learn a lot of stuff. It was like no, that was more about like kind of refining your place in society. Then at a certain point, they kind of opened it up, but only somewhat, and at that point, a lot of Jews started going to college, and that got them upset because now there are all these Jews here, and so the part of where this is about like finishing school for, Protestant society is kind of not feeling so good, and that's where you get a lot of these kind of quotas and all these kind of things where they would kind of like on the one hand we tried to expand it, but then it got kind of shaky, and we're not so sure we want to expand it. But even then, it was not that expanded, and now it's interesting because on the one hand, there's an even greater expansion of who can go to college, and on the other hand, there's also this now tension, this like there's a larger class of people that are going to college, and in some ways that causes even more tension with the people who don't go to college, because it's one thing when it's just like a handful of people versus well, when it's actually a big number of people versus an even bigger number of people who don't go, then you're starting to get into a place with like real social tension. So that's like interesting, and to sort of parallel what's going on in the Talmud. The other thing is that reading that page on Psachim, where they're saying such, kind of like disdainful things about the people who are not in the rabbinic elite, it reinforced for me what you've been saying all along about how we have to understand what the Talmud was, which was that it was a document that they not only meant for the elite, but they couldn't imagine in a million years that anybody but the elite would possibly read it. It wasn't by design. It wasn't like they could write it in even simpler language and nobody would read it. Like that, they're just, most people weren't literate, and most people weren't interested in reading something like that. So the Talmud that we have to understand it to be like a document that was really meant for a very, very tiny number of people to read. And that might be relevant to what we're going to talk about today. But then for our time, and I think this really puts the finger on this question of like, if we're now living in a time of a third founding, a time, like you say, where the Talmud system has crashed, and now we're looking to the Talmud to help us be guided in terms of how to build the next system. There's certain things in the Talmud that we want to replicate, like a certain sense of a kind of a person, a kind of, you're right, all that kind of thing. But we don't want to replicate certain things which are like the super elitist point of view, perhaps, right? And it's good to kind of know both the power and the limitations, I think, of the Talmud as we have it. And to some extent, where we see the limitations, like that's exactly why there's a crash right now, right? And so those are the things that we're going to have to think about differently.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, I was giving the crash talk the other night, and one of my students said, do all option threes, do all new systems that come about after a crash have to become master story, basically option one master stories? Do they have to always crash? And I typically say yes. But then I realized that theoretically we have the perfect system that's actually crash proof if access is maximized. Because if access to it is maximized, then you always have people who are going to say, wait a minute, before the story gets too perverted and weird, because it's been so protected and kept out of touch with so many groups who have been marginalized, in this chicken and egg process. So I'm thinking, I don't know, I was just thinking a lot about access, and how access is really the key.
Well, then the question is whether yes, if access could be maximized, and like you say, then it would be crash proof. But then the question is that a possible thing? Is it possible to have a system that is so accessible? And also, what about the people who don't want to access it,
right,
but who are potentially under the thumb of it?
Right. And then access is much more complicated. I'm sure I'm not the first person to realize this. It's not just here, this is available to you. There are all sorts of challenges in accessing, for example, the Talmudic tradition. It takes a lot of time. It's really, really time consuming. And, you have to have enough time where you're not making a living, and where you don't have to make a living, to be able to devote yourself to understanding it so that you can gain the tools and the techniques for being a player in the tradition, which is what I think it's here to do. And so, yeah, I'm thinking a lot about how to make this maximally accessible. And, as you and I were saying the other day, I once thought everyone was going to be a Talmudist. I don't think that's probably true anymore. But I sure want there to be more people, and more people with different life experiences who can go, wait a minute. Okay, I get the method, but here's a thing that they never thought needed fixing. You, B'nai, never even realized needed fixing. A whole bunch, but from my lived life experience, I can tell you it needs fixing. That's what we need.
Well, so maybe with that, we should just jump back into this text, because ultimately this is partly one way to understand where this text ultimately goes, is toward that kind of access, toward that sense of let's say self-determination and driving which ultimately drives towards that kind of access. So you want to give us a little bit of a recap of where we've been and where we're jumping off from?
Sure. Okay, so we're in the Tractate of Yoma, which generally deals with Yom Kippur. And we learned a Mishnah that said if someone has this particular illness, which is, it says pain in the throat. It's much more serious than a sore throat. It's this possibly life-threatening illness, which has as an early sign this sort of throat ailment. If someone has that ailment and you think it might be that on Yom Kippur, sorry, I'm confusing the cases. Wrong. That's not on Yom Kippur. That's on Shabbat. If someone has that ailment on Shabbat, you can do what would otherwise be a prohibited activity on Shabbat in order to give them medicine. You can uproot the herbs in your garden and boil them. Two things, for example, that we normally couldn't do in Shabbat to hopefully cure them. It may not cure them. They may not even be that sick, but you can do that even though those are death penalty violations otherwise on Shabbat. Okay, then it goes into the case that's really ours, which is on Yom Kippur. If someone is sick and says, I think the implication of the Mishnah is they need to eat. They've expressed their need to eat in spite of the requirement to fast on Yom Kippur, a requirement, the punishment for violating, which is it's divine extirpation. It's like this divine kind of capital punishment, the worst violation there is. In spite of that fact, if there are experts who are present and say, yeah, actually, you should eat, they should be allowed to eat because we are careful about people's lives. And if there are no experts present, that person's testimony about their own experience is enough. And if they say, I need to eat, you allow them to eat. That's not considered a violation of the fast. And they can eat as much as they want until they themselves say, okay, I've had enough. Okay, great. So that's the Mishnah. That's the 3rd century state of the law, which in and of itself is pretty much of a radical shift. I would call it an upgrade from Torah, because the Torah just says, afflict yourself, which the rabbis later say means fast and a number of other things. And it is a general, unqualified statement of you fast, period. Doesn't say, but if, and if you don't feel like it, and if you think, and if there's, no, fast, period. Which I think meant exactly that. I don't think it was ever understood in the biblical era to mean, but if, in the case, no, it was fast, and if, okay. So here we get this new opening up in the Mishnah. And then we get to the Gemara. So this is the next era, the next 400 or 500 years, looking at the Mishnah and expanding it, applying it, challenging it, destabilizing it, restricting it, doing all sorts of things to it to help it be able to be lived out and to upgrade it as we see fit. Okay, so now we get Rabbi Yanai 100 years later, and Rabbi Yanai says, if the sick person says, I need to eat, but the expert, let's say the doctor present, says, no, you don't need to eat. You can do your fast. You listen to the sick person and you let them eat. Why? Because, and they borrow a verse from, where was it? From Proverbs, that says, the heart knows its own bitterness. Lev yodea marat nafsho. So the individual, it seems to be saying, knows better than even an expert, even a medical expert, about the reality of their experience, and we should listen to them. Okay, that's Rabbi Yanai's first statement. Rabbi Yanai makes another statement. He says, and if the sick person says, I don't need to eat, I'm actually fine, I can do my fast, but the doctor says, no, you should eat, we don't listen to the individual in that case. In spite of the fact that we think generally the individual knows their experience best, we listen to the doctor and make them eat. Why is that? Oh, the text says because maybe he is like he's a victim of a symptom which gives him an untrue experience of the true seriousness of his ailment, and maybe he doesn't really experience the damaging hunger or need to eat, and would his own testimony of I don't need to would actually be detrimental to his health. Because that's a possibility, we're not going to listen to him, we listen to the doctor. Okay, that's where we left off last time. Go ahead.
Well, no, and just that, like, the obverse of that, I imagine, is that, and I forget if we mentioned this last time, but that he could have had the same confusion when he said, "I do need to eat," but nevertheless, we say, you know, we're going to err on the side of safety and say, well, maybe he actually doesn't. But if he feels that he does, even though he might be confused, then he eats. And in the opposite case, if he says he doesn't need to eat, we're going to err on the side of safety, saying, like, if he says he doesn't need to eat, but the doctor says he does, that's probably the confusion talking. So either way, we err on the side of safety.
That's right. And I think that's the takeaway, even though it looks like the takeaway from Rabbi Yanai's first point, that we listen to him and don't listen to the doctor, is we always listen to the individual. Whatever they say about themselves, we give them the ability to determine their status, their fate. It's actually not that. It's that unless we're concerned that their own testimony about themselves could actually lead to physical or emotional detriment, which I want to put a sticky on that, because that's challenging, you know, especially for people who know what it's like to have a doctor, a therapist, who knows what, some, you know, authority saying, I actually know better about you. And so that's just a very real thing.
All
so
right.
sticky there. Okay.
Yeah.
So that was Rabbi Yanai, and we jump in today where the editor of the Talmud is going to address Rabbi Yanai in relationship to the Mishnah. Okay.
Okay. So, so the Talmud goes on and it says, we learned in the Mishnah, if a person is ill, one feeds him according to the advice of experts, medical experts. That implies that if there are experts present, then according to the advice of experts, yes, one does feed the person, but if at his own instructions, no, one does not feed him. So what they're saying is that the Mishnah, the plain text of the Mishnah, seems to suggest that we go according to what somebody says, as if there are no experts there. But if there are experts there, we do what the experts say, not that only we do what the experts say if the experts are saying that he should eat, and not the opposite case.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
That's the simple text of the Mishnah.
That's exactly it. So the Stama, the editor here, is saying, is surfacing and visibilizing how Rabbi Yanai's two statements, his new law or new laws, actually contradicts the earlier Mishnah, which is against the rules. The rules of the game say that this later Amoraic generation, no one in that generation, and it's multiple generations, right? 400 years or so. The rule is they can't contradict a Mishnah. You can't overturn a Mishnah if you're from that era. But of course, it happens all the time. But they need to find a way to say that's not actually happening in order, it seems, to permit broader, more, I don't know if liberal is the right word. I don't know if liberatory is the right word. If more expansive law. There's a growing and different sensibility that you feel in Rabbi Yanai, and you feel like this is what the law, what they want the law to be, and they have to find a way to reconcile it with this Mishnah that the rules of the game say you can't contradict.
Yeah, and I just want to show the words of the Mishnah again, just to be clear that it says here, if a person is ill and requires food, one feeds him according to the advice of experts who determine that he needs the food. And if there are no experts there, one feeds him according to his own instructions. So according to the words of the Mishnah, that it appears, right? If you just kind of read this as like an originalism, right? But you just say, well, it appears that the general rule is we listen to experts. If there are no experts there, then the kind of exception is that if there are no experts there, then we can listen to the person. The Talmud is flipping it on its head and saying, no, it's either the person's it's as if the Mishnah said we feed the person according to his own will. That was the first thing that was said, which would suggest that was the general rule. And then something about experts might have been said second as some sort of exception. And then the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Gemara is limiting that exception even more and saying, no, it's only if the expert says that he does need to eat and the person says he doesn't need to eat that we listen to the expert. And so one way to say it is that they're actually flipping. It's as if they flipped the text and made the expert the exception rather than the person the exception, which is the plain meaning, or that they've completely kind of rewritten the text to say we lean to the side of safety rather than the side of risk, and that's not really present at all in the Mishnah.
Right. Okay. Now I didn't completely follow everything you said. So I'm gonna say it the way I understand it. You tell me if we're on the same page.
Okay.
Okay. We're now simply identifying where Rabbi Yannai's law is in conflict with the Mishnah, and two contradictions are going to be identified. Contradiction number one: Rabbi Yannai says, if the sick person says I need to eat, and the expert who's present, the doctor, says, no, you don't need to eat, we listen to the person and not the expert, and we let them eat. That's in contradiction to the place in the Mishnah that said, if experts are present, we listen to the expert, period, regardless of what the sick person says. So there's a contradiction.
Right, because in the Mishnah, the only place where it says we don't listen to experts, right here at the end, and if there are no experts there, one feeds him according to his own instructions. The implication being, if there are experts there, we listen to the experts. That's pretty straightforward.
And it's not only, I would say it's not only an implication, I'd say it's the explicit teaching.
Yeah.
Good. So that's contradiction number one. We haven't solved it yet, but we identified it. I think this is what leads me to feel that the Talmud is a textbook, a manual for how to make change, because it is showing the student how we're going to deal with the problems of people saying, hey, you can't do that. You can't make this new law. Oh, okay, you're going to make a new fabulous law? You're going to have people saying, hey, wait a minute, where is that in the concept? Where is that in the Torah?
In fact, it says the opposite right here. Right.
Exactly. Okay, so here comes, that was contradiction number one. Contradiction number two, it's a little hard for me to juggle the English and the Hebrew. So I can't remember, did you do the English for the second contradiction?
What's the second contradiction?
The second contradiction is the Mishnah says, quote, on the mouth of experts. Number one, imagine the first part of the word expert being in italics, meaning if there are experts present, you only listen to the expert. And Rabbi Yannai says you listen to the person. There's a contradiction. The second contradiction is where the word experts is now highlighted to highlight the letter S. Imagine only the letter S in bold. And we're understanding the Mishnah to be saying, and this is interesting because it probably never meant it, but okay, the Gemara is even putting a sharper point or lifting up even more contradiction, causing more problems to Rabbi Yannai by saying, your new law contradicts in a second way the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says, if he says, I need to eat, that's the implied case, he needs to eat, but there are experts present, you listen to the experts. But Rabbi Yana, you're saying it that if there's a single expert present, i.e. in the case of where the man says, I don't need to eat, you listen to the single expert. I hope I have that right. You listen to the single expert, whereas the Mishnah seems to require a multiplicity, experts. And Rabbi Yana, you're saying you listen to the expert when there's only one expert present. Now, sidebar on this, it's kind of interesting that this problem of, oh, Rabbi Yana, you only have a singular expert that you're listening to or you're authorizing, and the Mishnah requires a multiplicity, it seems to make a problem out of nothing, I think, because it probably never meant when it said experts. If there are experts present, it didn't mean if there's a multiplicity of experts present. It probably meant if anyone in the class called experts, right? I think you're on mute.
Right. Well, we might say if there's expertise present, something like that.
It's like, like if there's siblings present, it's like, no, I don't have to have multiple siblings, like anyone in that.
Or what we would have said what we would say in English, if there are any experts present, which we understand to mean if there's one that's fulfilling the clause. If there are any experts here, are there any experts here? We don't expect that there have to be three that arrive. One would be sufficient. Are there any doctors on the plane? Like if one comes,
That's
right. Enough. Right?
That's right. Anyway, I just find this interesting that they make the contradiction even bigger than it probably actually ever was.
Right.
Either to illustrate another technique of solving such problems when they are actually real. I don't know.
So I think that we haven't fully read through that part of Rabbi Yanai's opinion. So let's keep going, because I think that that's where we want to go. Right. So,
okay.
So just to read it again, from the beginning. So we learned in the Mishnah, if a person is ill, one feeds him according to the advice of experts. This implies that if there are experts present, then according to the experts, yes, one feeds the person, but at his own instructions, no, one does not feed him, contrary to Rabbi Yanai's opinion. So that was like the first contradiction in the Mishnah.
Right.
It further implies, this is the second contradiction, it further implies that according to the advice of several experts, yes, one feeds an ill person. However, according to the advice of only one expert, no, one does not feed him. That would, again, that's like the plain text they're saying, the plain text of the Mishnah, because it says experts, it suggests that you have to have more than one. And here Rabbi Yanai said a doctor, right? So they're saying that's the contradiction. And like you say, they seem to be constructing a meaning, a more limiting meaning in the Mishnah than even it has to be. The first contradiction is pretty clear from the text. The second contradiction is somewhat less clear. You could have much more easily just said like we just said, they mean any. They don't mean multiple experts. They mean any experts. So there appears to be a requirement in the Mishnah for at least two doctors, which also contradicts Rabbi Yanai's opinion of that the opinion of one expert is sufficient to override the opinion of the ill person. The Gemara rejects this.
Okay, so now that the Gemara has visibilized the contradictions, it is now going to solve what it was actually just an apparent seeming contradiction, but not a real contradiction, because it seems that the editor is committed to preserving Rabbi Yanai's expansive, innovative, more, loving, individual affirming legislation. The editor probably it's been accepted as law, and he likes it, and they want to keep it. And the question is, how do you keep that while also keeping the Constitution that says something else.
Right.
And I feel a little bit comfortable calling the Mishnah Constitution now. Usually I call just Torah that, because I just read an article by Michael Chernick, who is a Talmud scholar and a Talmud professor at HUC, who actually says we have three constitutions. And I'm finding this really interesting. He says Torah is one constitution. The Mishnah is in and of itself a full constitution, not just an amended. It's a full constitution. And the Talmud / Gemara, the document which encompasses both the Mishnah and the discussions on it, Gemara, that's a full constitution in and of itself. I don't know. I'm just interested in this thing that I just read.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that for sure. I would raise questions like, for example, maybe the Torah is not even at the level of a constitution. We could debate that. The Mishnah, though, for sure is a constitution. And then the question is whether the Gemara is, whether it's amendments or a constitution, or is it like just the case law? As if like if you look in the, or a way to think of it as like, what does it mean that it's the Constitution? It's like, I don't think we talked about this explicitly last week in the Amy Coney Barrett hearings, and I think it was more explicit in, I forget if it was the Kavanaugh hearings or the Gorsuch hearings. But there's this idea of the super precedent. And there's this question.
It's come out in the Amy Coney Barrett.
It's come out in the Amy Coney Barrett, but I think she's been very careful not to talk too much about details of a lot of things, including that. There was talked about in more depth, I think, with Kavanaugh, but there's this idea that what they mean by a super precedent is it's not in the Constitution. In the simple words of the Constitution, you could not find this idea. But, for example, Brown versus Board of Education, that has been around for so long, and nobody today credibly is arguing that the situation should be different. So it comes to this level where even though it's not in the Constitution explicitly, it now has the sort of the power of a constitutional provision. And, the question is, what are the criteria by which we decide that something is a super precedent versus a precedent? And, Amy Coney Barrett and these other conservatives, like their position is that Roe v. Wade is not a super precedent because it's never arrived at this place where there wasn't still a substantial opposition saying that there was a misunderstanding or a misconstrual of the Constitution. So therefore, it's still in the realm of a societal disagreement, and it's a precedent, and so we have to treat it with some respect, but it's not a super precedent, meaning that it's functionally the same as the Constitution. So in the Gemara, it may be that the whole Gemara is a super precedent. It may be that it's a constitution. It may be that right. It's maybe like it's a new constitution or it's constitutional amendments with that level. It could be that it's just a big super precedent, and so it's almost like a constitution, but not quite. Or it could be that within the Gemara there are some super precedents and some precedents and some junk, and right, or it's just legislation and it doesn't have the status of. I mean, all of those things are possible and they all are interesting.
Yeah, really interesting. And what came up for me as you were talking that I never connected? There's this concept that rabbis who are involved in the halachic process talk about, which is called Guf Torah. And it's this idea that this idea is so fundamental to the Torah, even though it's not explicit, right? This understanding of what the Torah means is so foundational that it can't be reinterpreted. Mm-hmm. And this term came to my consciousness, I first read it when I was reading Rabbi Joel Roth's opinions on the quote unquote gay issue, maybe 30 years ago. And he claimed that Leviticus named a Guf Torah, that there was this really fundamental prohibition of homosexuality, quote unquote, that you couldn't touch. And that just seemed messed up. That seemed it didn't seem true. Not only about that issue, but I don't actually think the concept of Guf Torah makes a lot of sense, and because actually in the same book, it's over there. Where is it? His pink book on a halacha systemic whatever, Rabbi Joel Roth's book. He himself acknowledges that there's actually nothing, theoretically nothing in the tradition or the Torah that can't be overturned. That anything can be overturned, including the entire Jewish system, in order to preserve its goals. That everything is on the table. So this whole Guf Torah thing seems weird to me. And it feels like a convenient way to say,
Right.
we don't want to challenge it. Just like super precedent. And this isn't a super precedent feels like a way to say, I don't like it.
Right.
I don't know.
No, but I mean, I think that's a serious thing, that a lot of these, we have to treat a lot of these categories with some degree of suspicion, whether it's in the American law or in the Talmud, because they can be used by results-oriented judges, so to speak. And by the way, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Meaning that if you think that there's really no such thing as a process that can work, like, John Roberts, when he was being confirmed, he famously talked about the role of a judge to be like an umpire in baseball, where you just call the balls and strikes, and you're not playing the game, and you don't pick a side and whatever. And that sounds good, but really, is that what's happening? And if you think that really there's no such thing, especially in the hard cases where you can't separate your worldview from participating in a process, then it's not necessarily a cardinal sin to say, and so you brought your worldview into this. It may or may not be that we should be a little more honest about it and a little more transparent about it, but maybe that's also bad for the system, because then it just seems like politics, and there's some value to the myth that it is an umpire. It's complex, but a lot of that stuff is that, and when you see an example of using one of these concepts as kind of a sword, a cudgel to kind of keep people down, then that's bad, and that, but it's also kind of, it's the difference between, it's a little bit the difference between using a kosher, using a fair tool, but using it unfairly, versus using a tool that you should never use. That by using it at all is problematic. And it probably is, like, these concepts are probably useful sometimes, but easily abused. And so how do you draw the line? And maybe that's where we come back to svara. Like, you have to believe and hope that people have reached a certain level of maturity and commitment to the process and commitment to the collective, and that they're not going to abuse it as much as they possibly can if they're aware.
Right. And if you look at Menachem Elon's, the late Deputy Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court and great scholar of Jewish law, as he defines svara, he says it requires a broad experience of people in the world and the relationships. You can't just be, a stupid white person and say, I'm actually qualified to make a law that's going to be just for all people and liberatory. There's actually a real requirement. It's like, who was it? Senator
Brian Schatz?
No.
Yeah.
Senator Brian, not Stevens? No.
Where's he from?
I forget. But
currently a senator?
He's currently a senator who was questioning Amy Coney Barrett and said, what have you read lately on racism and anti-racism? And nothing. Hey, these books you cannot even get them because so many people are buying them from Amazon and bookstores. They're like all the bestsellers. The world is now, and you're not, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't claim to have svara if you're not reading
Mm-hmm.
and you're not in relationship with, right, people who are different from you. And that just disqualifies you right off the bat from being a legislator.
Right.
In the Jewish system. And I would say that what he was saying was, I think it disqualifies you from being a Supreme Court judge.
because Amy Coney Barrett, one of the things that people say about her is that she's brilliant. She's absolutely brilliant. Noah Feldman, who is a professor at Harvard, and he writes for Bloomberg. He wrote this controversial op-ed where he basically said, I knew her from when I was a clerk on the Supreme Court, and there were two women that I would go to, two clerks. I would go to Amy Coney Barrett to understand this, to understand the depth of this law, because she was just brilliant and she could explain it to me. And then I would go to Jenny Martinez, who's now the dean of Stanford Law School, to kind of help me know what I should think about it, And actually, in that sense, and I hadn't seen it until just now, but in a sense, he's saying I would go to Amy Coney Barrett for Gemara and I would go to Jenny Martinez for Svara.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so then here's Amy Coney Barrett, about to be confirmed to the Supreme Court, and I think I don't remember who the senator was. It was not I don't think it was a Brian, because I don't think there was a Brian, but I'm not sure who.
I think his first name is Brian, Bryan. Is Brian Steve? Someone has got to be writing in and telling us.
I don't think so, but anyway,
okay.
It doesn't matter. But I remember the moment, and
okay, I'm gonna look on my phone. Why?
Okay, and what they're saying is like, it's one of these classic things of like, you're really smart, you're the smartest maybe, but you don't have svara because you haven't taken a human interest in what humanly is happening in the law. And if you're not reading about structural racism and you're not you figured it out.
No, I figured out who it isn't. It is not Brian Stevenson. That's what I was confusing him. That's not him. Okay. Yeah.
Anyway, so it's basically saying to her, and I totally agree with what you're saying. Like, if you haven't been reading about like race, if you're not reading Kendi or any of these things, Ta-Nehisi Coates, whoever, then you're not the kind of judge that we want. And it's not just because we're liberals, it's because we think that, it is also in that case, but like, it's because we believe that it's fine to have a conservative point of view, but only if only if you've decided to come there out of a knowledge of what's happening. And if you keep yourself ignorant by not reading this stuff, then, like you say, you've disqualified yourself. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and I love that the Jewish jurisprudential system has a rule that says you can't play. You just can't be at the table unless you are gamirna and savirna, unless you are learning in a committed learning relationship with the tradition. And what it meant for them was you had your Mishnahs memorized. That's what it meant.
Yeah.
Which is, by the way, a very small amount of learning.
Yeah.
And unless you were, you had this moral intuition that was a product of being in relationship with lots of people and informed and insightful into human beings. And yeah.
By the way, there's something like maybe to pick up on in the future on this question of like being smart versus being wise, because I feel like there was an article recently, now I can't remember what it was, but like something that talked about how the word smart is being used in our like in the press a lot more than it used to be. That somehow that smart has become a more important descriptor in our world in the last, let's say, 50 years. And you see, like, right, there was that sense that Amy Coney Barrett, because she's not taking notes and she doesn't have any notes in front of her, wow, she is smart, like she held up this blank notepad. I look at that and I'm like, I'm not impressed by that. Like, first of all, that's not really the job of a judge, is to like, they all have like 6 clerks. They don't need to remember everything in their head. That's not what makes them a great justice. Would be if they were wise and could kind of understand the intricacies of things. If you want to know, it's the same thing, go to your clerks. And it's the same thing that I've been also trying to say about, like, there's got to be a difference where in a world in which the entire Gemara is available in English translation. I know you're not the favorite of that or whatever, but it's available on Sefaria, for free to everybody. That's a different world from that older world where they used to talk about a rabbi who could put the pin through the Talmud and know exactly what word it came out on. Well, like that's not so important anymore because you could Google it. What's important is, do you know what it means? Like, do you know what to do with it?
Yeah.
So
And do you know how to approach law in the courageous, bold, yet traditionally radical way, the way that can keep the system together and still growing?
right,
Okay, it
right,
was Cory Booker. Sorry.
okay. There's a Y in his name. Okay.
Yeah, I think that was it.
There,
Okay.
there. Okay. So you keep going.
Yeah. Okay. So now we have to figure out, what are we going to do with this new law, Rabbi Yanai's law, that we love, while we also have this Mishnah that we're obligated to maintain. And this is where the real teaching of the Talmud begins. This is where it really tells you how to be a player, how to deal with those circumstances, because that is what you're going to be doing as a player, as a person who makes the tradition better. You're going to be making better laws, but you're going to have to sell them, not as shit you came up with. You have to sell it as really what the tradition has meant all along, and really as rooted in and all of that. And here comes lesson number 1 in how to do that. Okay, take it away.
And so the key thing, so the Talmud is saying, like, no, it's not a contradiction. Don't worry about it. It's not a contradiction. Right. Why? Why? Okay, so the Gemara says, with what are we dealing here? We're dealing with a unique circumstance.
Okay, good. So even before you go on, sorry. This is one of the challenges of learning in English, because what are we dealing with here sounds like colloquial English. But it turns out it's actually a literal translation of a set term, which, if you're learning in the original, pings for you immediately as one kind of strategic move in reconciling new radical law with less radical, not so good law. And how are you going to reconcile, sell, legitimate? And this is one move that signals to the learner, to the reader, oh, we are now going to say that the case in that earlier law, or the teaching in the earlier law, we misunderstood. You didn't understand it correctly. It's not an unqualified, broad statement. It actually is narrow and applies only to this circumstance. This move is called an ukimta. It's the move whereby you take two contradictory traditions, one that the new one you want to keep, and it separates them by distinguishing the earlier one as applying only to a particular narrow case which you're not interested in, allowing space for the new, more radical teaching to be no longer in explicit contradiction. So now you're safe with it.
Right, and I was going to say, in American law, you said the word. This is the exact same thing exists, and it's called distinguishing the cases. Mm-hmm. And you say, yeah, that case was you're right about that ruling, but that was a very narrow situation. Like, the broad ruling is actually different. Now, why the Mishnah wrote the narrow case and not the broad case? That, look over there. Don't ask that. But yeah, so it says, no, we're actually dealing with this narrow case where the person says, I do not need food, and the consultation of experts is required. The Gemara suggests, but let them feed him according to the advice of one expert. As Rabbi Yanai said, that in such a circumstance, one feeds the ill person based on the advice of one doctor. And the Gemara says, no, there's a requirement for two experts is necessary in a very particular case where there is a third expert who says, okay. Right? So the Mishnah that we have only deals with a very particular case where there were three experts there, right? And two of them were in contradictory opinions. And then you say,
okay, wait a minute, but you oh my God, you're going so fast. You've moved through two different moves.
Okay.
Meaning two different back and forths, each of which is another lesson in law school.
Okay.
So I really want to be sure we all see how radical this this sort of chain of moves is. Okay, so the first solution, the first way we're going to reconcile Rabbi Yanai to the Mishnah is saying, oh, the Mishnah was only, when the Mishnah said we feed him on the word of experts, that was only when he said, I don't need to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because now, if that is true, which it clearly wasn't, but let's say, right, if they're going to retroject that truth into it, then that idea reconciles with Rabbi Yanai, because Rabbi Yanai himself says, if the sick person says, no, I don't need to eat, I can do my fast, we actually do listen to the expert who says, no, you need to eat, we're going to let you eat.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So that is move number one. Then the challenge comes back and says, but wait a minute, that's still not a good enough reconciliation. Okay, so this is yet another layer of no, that's not good enough, because Rabbi Yanai says you only need one doctor to allow him to eat, and the Mishnah says you need experts, a multiplicity of experts. Okay, now we've got another problem again. We got to solve that problem. And the way we're solving that problem is we're further restricting what the Mishnah actually meant, wink, 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 because clearly it didn't, and saying, oh, in the Mishnah where we need experts is where the sick person is in bed saying, no, I don't need to eat, I'm fine. And there's another doctor there saying, no, he's fine, agreeing with him, saying he's fine, he doesn't need to eat. Now we've got the sick person and one expert on one side saying,
Mm-hmm.
no, doesn't need to eat. That's the case where you need experts.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so I just think it's important to see, because we're starting to chuckle, I think.
Uh-huh.
And I think the Gemara wants you to start realizing what it's doing. So as soon as you start laughing, you have to go, oh, it wants me to see this as obviously not, what's the word, naive or pietistic. It wants to show me that the narrowing is so far-fetched that we know that that's not what it meant.
Right.
And this is a legitimate move to make, to expand the law and sell it.
Right.
So,
right.
And it's going to keep going this way over and over and over.
Right. And you, because you do get this feeling like, and this happens in, when you distinguish and narrow the case, you're like, wait a second, we have a Mishnah. It's not that long. Like, it's pretty short, but like, why is it wasting time on this like narrowest of cases if the broad rule is that we do the opposite? Why didn't it actually tell us explicitly we do the other thing? And it's like, so, and the only conclusion you can come to is because that wasn't what it originally meant. So then you kind of are in this world where okay, so if that's not what it originally meant, and the rabbis are working so hard to get it to mean that now, then, you start to see, well, why? They clearly are think it was wrong. They clearly are trying that something has either changed or they have realized that this is just a mistake. And our system doesn't allow us to say the Mishnah made a mistake. So the only thing that we can do is narrow the case. But then as you narrow the case that much, what you create actually is a vacuum. Because there's, and then you're saying, well, in a vacuum, now we have a broad case that we can put in because it doesn't say anything, or even by implication, because it had this very, very narrow exception that it had, then the broad case must be the opposite, but all of that is just constructed. It's what do you call it? Hand waving or sleight of hand. Right, where it's just like, if you really think about it a little, and then that also raises this question: well, if the Talmud is a document that's originally meant for this like tiny elite, then what you're showing people is like, this is how you do it. This is the sleight of hand. It's like magician school. It's like, right, a magician never reveals his tricks, right? This is the manual. This is like that. I remember as a kid, like I always wanted to find the magician manual. Like, where is it where you can really find out how the tricks are done? But this is how, and
I
now
love that. I love that. That's what it is.
Right. And now that we like dug it up, now it's like we have the magician, like all of a sudden we're reading this and we're really like, that's how they were doing it. Like I remember when my uncle, who was this like amazing magician when I was a kid, and he could make things disappear and whatever. And then I remember coming to visit him with my cousin who was much, much younger. And, I was probably in my 20s and she was, 5. And my uncle was doing these tricks for her. And all of a sudden I'm watching and I see like he's tossing, I see what he's doing. And it was like, it wasn't shattering because like, of course I knew by that point but it was like so eye-opening that I was like, oh, that's how he did it. Right. So that's what's going on here.
I love that. Magician school is so helpful. And it, like you say, it puts its finger on the access situation, because you don't want the whole public to go to magician school.
Right.
You really only want a very small number of people, the people who you're raising up to be magicians, the people who need to know how the trick works, to do the trick, to entertain the people, in this case, to legislate for the people. But yeah, that's really, really helpful.
Right.
And it also it challenges me about, my idea that this should be open to everybody.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Like, I think that there's a way to extend, I'm not sure quite what it is yet, but there's a way to, I think, extend the analogy and to say, look, at the point at which people are sort of mature enough to know, look, these tricks, like we all kind of know it's not real. Like what we start to see in the world of magic is that the tricks they're much more intricate. Like if you look at what's that show, America's Got Talent, for example, and you see the tricks that they're doing now, they're incredible. Like, and you can't even imagine, how did this guy run across the, right? And when you would go back and see probably what Houdini was doing or something, you would be like, that's, it's not that impressive. Now we all know how he did that trick. And it's like, so it's okay. Like at a certain point when people are kind of grown up enough to say, like, this is insulting to sit through this trick now. It's insulting to me that you think I'm so stupid that I don't know how. I might not know exactly how you do that trick, but I know that there's a hole in the bottom of the bag or whatever it is, right? So at that point, it's like, okay, so yeah, you're right. Here, read the book. This is how it was all done. And I think it's like those of us who read a biography of Houdini, it's fun because you're like, oh, now I really get it, whatever. But you still enjoy coming to a magic show with the new kind of tricks, and I don't know. I feel like there's something there. There's something about the democratization of the old tricks allows the new tricks. And I don't mean to say that these are tricks. That's not my, but
yeah. Yeah. And I'm always asking myself if their techniques could still work today. I mean, people don't have this pietistic relationship with Torah such that they're going to be willing, most people, in some communities it still works, but in, I would say, most liberal Jewish communities, no one's going to actually be sold by saying, oh, because there's the vav over here and the vav over here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I remember now I know like what, about law, what could fit in a grain of sand. But before I knew even what could fit in a grain of sand, I thought, oh, svara, that source of law everything has to be svara. But then I realized that our legal system only rarely acknowledges that the judges are using, their sense of moral intuition. They do sometimes.
Right.
To overturn law, like when Kennedy said Hardwick v. Bowers was wrong then. This was the case that in 1986, which upheld sodomy laws.
Yeah.
Bowers v. Hardwick was Hardwick v. Bowers. It was wrong then. It is wrong now. Mm-hmm. Right. And I'm overturning it because gay people have a right to a dignified life of sexuality.
Right.
The law, but even American law rarely does that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I don't know. It just makes me wonder how we're going to sell the new, the next version of the Jewish tradition as traditional.
Well, something that you said that I think is a good place to close, and then we'll pick it up again next week, is that you alluded to this particular interpretive technique called Gzera Shava, or more or less, where you pick one word in this sentence and one word in this sentence, and you say, like, and because the same word is in both of these completely unrelated sentences, therefore we can connect them and make some, spiritual. And that's one of these. I feel like Gzera Shava is going to be one of those magic tricks that's not going to make it to the next level. Right? Like it's too transparent at a certain point it's not real. But to study how they used Gzera Shava in this, 2,000 years, 1,500 years ago, whatever, in this kind of environment and what they were trying to do with it, if you read it and you say, and therefore we should continue to use this particular technique of Gzera Shava in the future. So we're going to take a word from the Constitution and a word from the Torah and somehow do a mashup and make some, that's not going to fly. But if you say that, like, the point is that, like, yeah, but what we're learning from this is not that technique. We're learning that there are techniques, that there and some of the old ones are going to stay, and some new ones are going to be invented. What's traditional, but it is traditional to have this a little bit loose relationship with the Constitution, or to say it in a more sort of respectful way, right? That there are, when the liberals talk about a living constitution, or penumbras and emanations, that there are these fundamental principles. The Constitution doesn't always know how to say them as principles. And so it's our job sometimes, when we see it from like a different point of view, to say, there's actually a principle there that we can now establish in writing more explicitly and give it the weight of the Constitution. That might be ultimately a super precedent. However that goes, like, it's not, and like you've been saying all along, if you read the Talmud for its cases, like if you think the Talmud is a law code and these particular cases it talks about are important, then you're missing the whole thing. And I would take it to the next level and say, and if you think that all of the techniques that the Talmud shows is telling us that we should use those techniques to now make a new kind of Judaism, you're also missing the point. Like, it's not about its cases or its techniques. It's about that you should have cases and have techniques, right? And some of them will be old ones and some will be new, and that's the tradition.
I love that. That really is helpful for me, because I think I've been too aggressively holding on to, okay, this is the methodology. This is the menu of tools or the set of tools we have in our tool belt. And really, that's what we got. I think you're right. I love this.
All right.
It's tools, not these tools.
Yeah, use tools.
And it's bold, courageous innovation that makes the tradition more compassionate for more people. And yeah.
And that's the and maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I think it is. You think it is, but ultimately, right? What our task is to understand in that, like, deepest of ways, what is this really trying to do? That's why I love the story so much of the opening, the guards removed from the gates, that we did early on, because because it's not only did they remove the guards from the gates and then, like, tons of people flooded in, but then the first thing that they took on was, can we let even more people in? And that's a story that, like, I would really lift up and say, that's one of these stories that reveals the intent of the whole project, is to let more and more and more people in. Is that true? Was that their original intent? I don't know. But when I read that and I think about, like, the world in which we live in and where we see things going wrong, it's like, that would be a better world where you're always trying to bring more people in, right? So let's lift that up and let's find all the tools to make that a fundamental principle. So
I love that. I'm so glad you went back there, because the way you framed that landed for me in a whole different place. And okay, I want to say one more thing, and I know we're over time, and that is, one thing I've learned over my 18 years at Svara is that, I'm not any longer the queerest thing on the block.
Mm.
And there's always someone queerer than me who gets an insight about what it means to be a human being, that maybe about sexuality, maybe about gender, maybe about race, maybe about a whole bunch of things, but I have to listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and we always have to be asking the question, who's not here? And that story, that being the first story, let's be sure we're not the last queer, you
Right.
know, group of people, and we're looking for the ones who are still excluded and say,
Right.
hey, no, even they, I love that.
Right.
I
All
love
right.
that.
Well, good place to end.
Okay.
Very in line with our theme, and we'll pick this up again next week. This is a great text to be bringing out all this stuff.
Yeah. Thanks,
All
Dan.
right. See you next week, Vinay.
Bye.